My guest today is a video game executive whose career spans the medium's earliest home computers to the rise of the modern console business. He created his first games for the Atari 800 in the early 1980s before joining Microsoft in 1986, where he spent a decade as an early developer on Excel and Word. In 1996, he left the Office team to pursue his passion for games, founding Microsoft Game Studios and laying the groundwork for the company's entry into interactive entertainment. During the next 8 years, he grew the division from 50 people to more than 1,200, publishing more than 100 games, including more than a dozen million sellers, and co-founding the original Xbox project. Since retiring from Microsoft in 2004, he's worked as an advisor, board member and investor, and in 2019 helped launch One Up Ventures, a fund dedicated to supporting independent game developers around the world. Welcome, Ed Fries.
Thanks, Simon. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so nice to see you, Ed. I wonder, let's start at the point where sort of everything starts to happen at Microsoft on Xbox. You're at the company, you've helped build the game studios, and then suddenly you're part of this plan to launch a video game console, something Microsoft's never done before.
Oh my gosh, we're starting in the middle.
We're going to start in the middle and then we'll work back. How did that conversation begin and what was your reaction to it?
Yeah, I mean, we had been growing our PC game business for several years and we're starting to make progress. Of course we had Flight Simulator. That was kind of the basis of the business when I took over in 96. And then Age of Empires and that great series made by Ensemble Studios. And so, and then just started making some acquisitions and growing the team, bringing in people like FASA Interactive, Jordan Weissman and his guys to do great things like Crimson Skies, and
Brilliant
Warrior,
game.
of course. Yeah, but by the late 90s, it was getting harder and harder to grow our share in the PC game business. We were creeping up on Electronic Arts, but every share point was getting a little tougher. And yet, there was a whole big part of the game business that was completely untouched by us, which is the console gaming business, which we really didn't know that much about. And then, there was a group of kind of crazy guys out of the Windows team. They're evangelists for the DirectX part of Windows, which is the part of Windows that you use if you want to make a game. And they asked for a meeting with me one day, and I said, sure. And they dropped by my office, and they took over my whiteboard and started to draw some pictures, tell me this crazy story about something they wanted to build called the DirectX box, or just the Xbox for short. And it was their idea of how Microsoft could enter into the console business. And as originally pitched, the game was, or the machine was actually, it was a PC pretending to be a video game console. It was very much just a vanilla PC, but it would run software so that when you inserted a CD, it would, pretend like it was, booting up the game, but it was really installing the game quietly in the background and then letting you play. So the original plan was not as ambitious as it became.
What was your reaction in that moment then? As you're looking at the whiteboard, had you any inkling that anyone was even thinking of this sort of thing in the company?
I knew that there was another group that had been working with the Sega Dreamcast, the Windows CE team, and they had done a little work to get a version of Windows running on the Dreamcast. So, but it wasn't anything I took very seriously. What these guys were saying initially was, hey, you've got this big portfolio of PC games. What if you could sell it to more customers through a machine that let console players, play PC games? And so to me, that sounded interesting, right? It's like, great. I instead of having to work with a Nintendo or a Sony, we could enter this business, with the products more or less that we have. Now, that's obviously very naive and it isn't what ultimately ended up happening. But you're asking me about the start, and that was the start.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we never ended up with Flight Simulator on the original Xbox, I don't think.
for example.
Yeah.
That's often how things begin. And so I basically pledged my support to these guys, which was important for their, idea to take off, because I was the only one in the company making games, and I had the resources to try to help make this happen. So
yeah, what kind of, obviously you're the first point of contact here. They need to get your buy-in. How much power did you have in the company to actually give it a green light? Who did you have to convince? Did it go all the way to the top?
Yeah, so it did a couple times. Basically, the first battle that we had to have, and this is very much kind of Microsoft internal politics, is we sort of had to get the right to grab that idea as something that our team should do and not another team. And there was another team that wanted to do it, and that was that Windows CE team that had worked with Sega Dreamcast. They, it turns out, had their own plan, and that for Microsoft to build a console, and it was very different than our plan. They wanted to build a whole new machine, hardware and software, basically a Microsoft version of Sony PlayStation. And there were some ex-3DO people on that team, and so there was some reason to believe that they knew what they were talking about.
And were they pitching you as well? That team, the rival team?
No,
right.
That might have been one of their strategic mistakes. The Xbox guys maybe got to me first, but I teamed up with them, and I don't remember ever hearing from the other guys. I do think they approached me originally when they were doing the Dreamcast booting into Windows mode, and I said, I don't really see that working. I wasn't interested in making games for that. But anyway, so, move forward a few months, and we're in a big meeting, and it's Bill and Steve, and it's like the two teams are presenting against each other, and Windows CE guys go first, and they present their whole plan. And
really? Like you're both in the room at the same time?
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
It's like we had
like a dance off.
We had our vice presidents on our side, and they had their vice presidents on their side that they had teamed up to support their thing, and exactly like a dance off. So they went first, and they presented their plan, and it was, like I said, very much kind of a Microsoft built Sony PlayStation, and then we got to present, which fortunately I didn't have to do, and we basically kind of did this Microsoft thing where we kind of positioned their plan as not being very Microsoft. It was like, well, look, we're using, we're going to run on standard PC hardware, with x86 CPUs, and we're going to run Windows, and we're going to,
fully integrated
PC games. We're on strategy. These guys, they want to get Microsoft in the hardware business. Microsoft doesn't build machines. I mean, we build mice and keyboards, but even that's a stretch. And they're not running any Microsoft software. Their whole plan is off strategy. Ours is on strategy.
That's pretty extraordinary, though, to have you sort of sitting across from each other, and you're sort of, your plan is to attack the other group, and you're all supposed to be on the same side. But
I know, looking back on it, it does seem kind of strange. But it being in the middle of Microsoft culture, it just seemed like the way things were done, right? I mean, I had been there since I was a kid. I was been
right.
there. I went to work there when I was 20 as a summer intern. So
yeah. And so you said Bill Gates and Steve has sat there sort of as the judge and jury here.
Exactly.
Are you, as the kind of, executive who's backing your team, are you watching them carefully to see what the reaction is?
I don't know. You're asking a lot about a meeting from 30 years ago.
True,
25 years ago. But what I do know is they knew me pretty well. They knew me from the office days, from both Excel and Word, and they knew my contributions to those projects. And I think I had a fair amount of political capital with them. And so I think that probably helped. But really, I think the DirectX guys who were the ones presenting did a good job of pitching this vision for why we should get the resources basically to go forward and why the other team shouldn't. And that's ultimately what happened. We sort of won the meeting.
Do you remember how long it took? How long did it take for you to hear that you'd won the meeting?
Pretty quickly.
Right.
Yeah, pretty quickly. And so their project basically got kind of dismantled. And in fact, some of them ultimately came over to become part of Xbox as Xbox grew. But really, that was just the start of us spending a year seeing if our plan even made sense. And over that year, it became more and more clear that the original plan didn't make sense, and some of the things that the other guys had been saying, made a lot more sense than what we said. And so by the time we got to the end of that year and represented to Bill and Steve, it was really kind of what we're presenting was somewhere halfway in between the original Xbox project and the Windows CE group project.
Very interesting. I had Seamus Blackley on the show last year, and he was talking about one of the things that, in his perception, the reason that they were able to get it made was because there was something about the sort of pluckiness that reminded some of those, executives who had been there from the very start of what they'd done back in the, 70s or whatever. And, does that resonate with you?
Well, let me say a few different things. One is that, our original plan was to work with the existing, what we call OEMs, the hardware manufacturers. So we went out, a guy named Rick Thompson was our temporary head of the group. He was the guy who ran Microsoft's hardware business. And he went out and visited like the Dells and the Compaqs of the world and that kind of thing. And they basically all laughed him out of the room. They're like, we're not idiots. We know that in the console business, you lose money on the hardware and make money on the software. So no, we're not going to build your hardware so that you can make the money on the software, So there was that feedback. Getting back more to your question about what Seamus said, I would say that at that time, and I think this is true of Microsoft even today, the company was built around a small number of really big businesses, and it was hard to get anything small off the ground if it didn't have a multi-billion-dollar ambition. At that time, the PlayStation was making 40% of Sony's profit, and Sony was a big company, So I think it was, something that was of the scale of the kinds of businesses that they were looking to support. There was also an argument that we made, the company motto from the time I started was a computer on every desk and in every home running Microsoft software. And, part of our argument was, hey, we've done pretty good at the office, but we haven't done much at the home, and so if you're really serious about home, the biggest business by far is the game console business. And so I think it was more arguments like that than maybe the nostalgia, but who knows?
All right, Ed. Well, we'll come back to the story and pick up what actually happens when you get to launch the thing in a little bit. But first, let's turn to the premise.
I love
of the
way you're
podcast.
laying this out. Okay.
So I've asked you to pick the 5 games you'd like to put on your ideal fictional games machine. We're going back to the very dawn of modern computer games for your first one, which incidentally Seamus also picked for his first game on his console.
Oh my gosh! I should have listened to Seamus's.
No, of course. So yeah, tell us, this is by many considered to be the first video game. What is it and why do you love it?
Yeah, I think it is. The first video game in my mind is Space War.
I started talking up the idea of having a spaceship trainer. Spaceships were very much in the news. It was abundantly clear that people didn't know how to fly spaceships very well. And eventually the critical chorus at the Model Railroad Club and elsewhere said, "That's a great idea, why don't you do it?" After talking it up for 8 weeks or so, I finally got shamed into writing code. And in the fall of 1961, I had a demonstration program that had 2 spaceships which could maneuver around the screen and could fire torpedoes at each other.
An intergalactic dogfight, and they would call it Space War.
1962, made at MIT, Steve Russell was one of the programmers, but the most important programmer. It's, 2 spaceships battling around a sun. It's a 2-player game where you try to shoot the other guy before he shoots you, or try not to get sucked into the sun at the same time. Yeah, it's the first really fun video game, but also, it has had an influence on the industry that's just sort of echoed through time. I mean, in 1971, I really started in 1970. 2 guys sitting in their office, that wanted to try to build. They had seen Space War running on, I think, a DEC mini computer, and said maybe we could do that now out of these chips that are now available, and set off to do it. And those 2 guys were a guy not that many people know named Ted Dabney, and his office mate, Nolan Bushnell. You would think that would lead to Atari, but it really not directly. Like first, they actually, the 2 of them, one, they're both good engineers. One was probably a great engineer, Ted Dabney, and one was a good engineer and a great businessman and salesman, with Nolan Bushnell. They managed to build really the first, kind of home-built arcade machine, using just an off-the-shelf television. They figured out and patented how to make a television draw things where you wanted them under control of a computer, not a television broadcast. They built this thing, and they ran all around, Chicago area, which is where all the electromechanical arcade machines and pinball machines came from, and nobody would touch the thing. And, the famous story is that Nolan Bushnell was complaining about this to his dentist in Silicon Valley. They worked at Ampex in Silicon Valley. And his dentist said, "Oh, I know somebody I have another client who builds arcade cabinets." And it turned out to be a company called Nutting Associates. And anyway, so dentist connects them together, and ultimately they, Nolan Bushnell ends up leaving and working for Nutting as their chief technology officer. And they put out a game called Computer Space. And that was the first kind of attempt to make Space War work in the arcades. I could go on for days on this, so I'm gonna stop and let you hear it.
What's your own personal relationship with Space War? Did you play it as a kid? I mean, obviously not accessible at all for most people.
Yeah, so I was born in 1964, grew up in the Seattle area. And there was a computer space machine down at basically under the Space Needle. There's kind of an amusement park right under the Space Needle. And that's a place I used to run down as a kid and play pinball machines and electromechanical arcade machines. And so I saw it there. Didn't think much of it at the time. It was kind of a tricky game to play. But by 1977, a version called Space Wars came out. It was actually, they called it Space Wars instead of Space War because Star Wars came out that same year. And that was the Cinematronics version of Space War, which is very much more like the real game. I saw that. That was about the time I was entering high school and falling in love with computers. And first, the Apple IIs that we had at school, I was lucky enough to have, and then I got a Atari 800 as a Christmas present from my parents, and that I just fell in love with both the games on that machine, great games like Star Raiders, but also writing my own games first in BASIC. And then the first assembly language game that I ever made was my version of Space War.
Right. Okay.
And so it has that meaning to me too.
So, I mean, yeah, it describes to me growing up in Seattle. Your parents are obviously not completely suspicious about these video games because they buy you a console. What were they doing in life?
Yeah, so my parents met at engineering school at Bucknell University. Not too surprising for my dad, but my mom was also an engineer. Not that many engineers, female engineers in the 50s, and fell in love. Both moved out here to Seattle and to work for Boeing. And Seattle was very much a Boeing town at that time.
Working on airplanes?
Yeah. So my dad came out first because he was 2 years older. And then my mom followed him out when she graduated. My dad worked kind of most of his career on commercial airplanes, but also on every once in a while on defense projects. He worked a lot on instrument landing systems and things like that. But one of his first projects was something called the Beaumark. Okay. The Beaumark was basically a surface-to-air missile. It looked like an airplane though. And imagine like a radio-controlled airplane that's also a giant nuclear bomb.
Right.
And so it was this remote controlled airplane, and the idea was they would fly up into the incoming Russian bomber fleet that's going to drop nuclear bombs, on America. This is all Cold War stuff. And then it would detonate. So you'd have this giant, midair nuclear explosion, which really not a good thing. But I guess if you're going to blow up the whole country anyway, why not? And take out as many of these incoming Russian bombers as possible. So that was one of my dad's first projects. I have a picture over there of a Beaumark. My mom
That must have been right around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis then, I guess, like late 60s or something. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. My brother was born in 62, and then my twin sister and I were born in 64. So my mom came out, and she but this was still in the 50s. She came out and she had a chemical engineering degree. And so they put her to work on the Dynasaur. And the Dynasaur, I think it's Dynasoar, so it's a little pun, was the precursor to the space shuttle. And so my mom worked on the heat tiles for the predecessor to the space shuttle. Just to say a little more about my mom, just real quick. I mean, she was like probably one of the only female engineers there, and really didn't like it there very much. There was a lot of discrimination.
I bet. Yeah.
When she left to have us kids, and then went back to get a master's in computer science, and so by the time I was in junior higher, so she was working at Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC.
Oh, she was, right.
My dad was continuing to work at Boeing. So at that point, an electrical engineer dad and a computer science mom. My brother ended up getting an electrical engineering degree. I got a computer science degree as I was into computers.
It's worth mentioning that DEC, the company you mentioned there, your mom working for, they made the PDP-1, which was the computer that Space War was designed on.
Exactly. They made the PDP-11, which Rogue was designed on. It was like, basically there were mainframes, big computers, and there were mini computers, which were smaller, but still big computers. I have a couple here in the office. I have a PDP-8 and a PDP-11 that work.
You do. So cool. Yeah. Well, it seems like destiny where you were headed from my perspective.
It kind of does. At that time, it felt like a free choice, but certainly my parents were bringing stuff home all the time. My dad would bring home these, ridiculously expensive programmable calculators. I remember playing with those as a kid. I was just going through some of his stuff and found an old piece of glass that was a hologram he showed us early on, with shooting laser through this glass and making an image of chess pieces that all of us kids remember really well. But I would go with my mom to University of Washington when she was working on her master's in computer science, and watch her do her punch cards and stuff like that. I'm glad I never, by the time I was at computer science, I didn't have to do punch cards.
Oh, so good. All right, Ed, we better come to your second game, which you just mentioned there, which is from 1980. So I guess, tell us what the game is first and how you came to encounter it.
Yeah, so the game is Rogue.
How long has it been? How long since I began my journey through this maze of underground passageways and damp, dimly lit chambers?
How long have I been alone? The only human among a menacing crew of hideous subterranean beasts.
How long since I began my quest for the prize spoken of only in hushed tones by even the bravest guildmasters, the Amulet of Yendor.
Through these unlit corridors I wander, stumbling in the dark, encountering new ordeals at every turn.
Everywhere, I am relentlessly pursued by beasts and demons. I cannot begin to count them.
Each time I sleep the sleep called death, I find myself cruelly carried back to the highest level of this cursed dungeon.
I graduated from high school and was heading off to college. I was accepted to the University of Washington, but that was where my brother and sister were, so I didn't want to go there. So I found a little school in New Mexico and went to this tiny little school called New Mexico Tech, or its full name is New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology. And they had a great computer science program, and it was kind of fun to get away for 4 years. And so I left the rain and the trees here in Seattle and went to the desert. There, the computer science students had their own computer. It was a VAX 11750, also a DEC machine. And it had one really, really good game on it called Rogue. And Rogue, everyone knows there's roguelikes, and,
We still play them today.
They're all based on this one game, Rogue. And Rogue, it always bothers me when, of course, we talk to game developers all the time as part of One Up Ventures, but, I like to ask if they ever actually played the original Rogue, because, the original Rogue is really fun. And it does some really unique things. And, one part of the game, it's kind of brutal difficulty-wise, and there's a lot of randomness to it. I mean, you're kind of thrown into this dungeon, and, if you don't find food, you starve. If you don't, and it's random every time, right? If you don't find decent armor, when you put a piece of armor on, there's a decent chance it could be cursed, and then you can't take it off unless you find, the right spell. All the spells are encrypted, so the names are encrypted. So you have no idea. The names just look like garbage until you cast them, and they're, as likely to do something bad to you as good to you. And same thing with the potions. You have no idea. They're just colored. You don't know what, a potion might make you blind, and then you can't see, and you have to stumble through the dungeon till a monster kills you. It's really brutal.
I don't think that would get through audience testing these days.
But it was so, I can just tell you, it's just so compelling when you play it. And, I have it here running on my PDP-11, and, I've put, my kids' friends on it, and they'll just sit there and play for hours because it's really amazing. And yeah, you die, but then you just go back in and you play some more, see if you can get farther each time. So,
yeah. Yeah, I've just been playing Hades 2, which is, of course, the most recent version of a roguelike. And some of the things you're describing there, you can still see them in the games that are being made, 40 years later, nearly. Yeah, incredible. Okay, let's come back to your story then. So, yeah, you play Rogue while you're studying computer science, and is the dream really already at this point that you want to make games, or are you open to other things?
Yeah, in a way, we kind of skipped a little forward, so I'm going to go back a little bit.
Sure.
So in high school, so I had always grown up around all this technology and electronics and stuff like that, and I was pretty comfortable with it. But I wasn't sure what I wanted to do until personal computers came out. And then I really fell in love with them. Typing in games out of magazines is kind of the way people used to start. Like me, I was working at a pizza place trying to save up enough money to buy a game, for my machine.
Mm-hmm.
Our pizza place had arcade machines in it, so that was always nice. You could, play at night after work. And yeah, I just started, first typing in games, then writing my own games in BASIC for me and my friends, then, writing games in assembly language, which you really need to do if you want to run fast enough to look good on the machine. Space War was my first game that I did. And then the second game I did was a clone of Frogger. I'd seen Frogger in the arcades, and I thought, okay, this is a game that's simple enough. I think I can do it, So I wrote a Frogger clone called Froggy, and I just passed it around to some friends, and it went over. There was no internet back then, but there were bulletin boards, and it kind of made its way around the country.
Oh, it
and
did.
Then one day, these guys showed up. So this would be 1981. Guys showed up at Shakey's Pizza, and they had tracked me down. They're from California, and the game just said "By Eddie Freeze," and I have no idea how they found the right Eddie Freeze in the country. I have a pretty unusual last name, but
yeah.
So yeah, they showed up and had a contract ready and wanted to take the game. And
I thought it was going to be the people behind Frogger coming to shut you down.
No. It was the opposite. Well, kind of. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, it was like, I don't know, Cinderella story, maybe. Cinderella story that comes with no advance and 5% royalty.
And you're like 18, 19 years old at this point, and you're getting hired as a game developer. Is that right?
16, 17.
Wow.
Years old. Still in high school. That's why I said I'm going back a little bit in time.
Yeah.
So, I started to work for them. I was, first redoing Frogger because Froggy was straight up Frogger clone. They were worried we were going to get sued, so they had me change something. So instead of like there being cars on the street, they wanted to have like a medieval theme. They called it Princess and Frog. So the cars turned into jousting knights, and then
the frog becomes a toad.
No, the frog was still a frog. I know. It's like if you're going to get sued over something, you'd think it would be the frog, right? It wasn't my problem, but they didn't change that many other things. There was, when you got across the water, there were like lips that would move back. When you went into one of the holes, then it would be like you were kissing the princess, but all I could draw was the lips. So you'd jump the frog onto the lips, and then it would turn into like the head of a prince. Anyway, that was Princess and Frog. So I finished that up during my first year in college, and then I went on to do 2 more games for them, a game called Anteater and a game called Sea Chase. And I was working on the 4th game for them during my second year at college in 1983. And basically, I had only ever met these guys in person when they showed up at, Shakey's Pizza.
So yeah, are you sending them your like discs then or something when you write a game?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. I would actually like call up and download, I think, the versions to their machine or something with my modem. But yeah, and they would send me equipment sometimes. And they sent me royalty checks. It really helped pay for my college.
How much do you think you made from those games?
$10,000.
Right. Yeah. Not bad at like 17 though.
Yeah, that was real money for me, for sure. But by then I'm in college, so I'm, 19, 18, 19, 20. And then, they just stopped answering the phone. And that's when I started to realize the whole game industry was breaking apart in 1983, 1984. And that's kind of the great crash of the game business. So had to get a real job. Got a job working in the computer center running that VAC 750 that played Rogue, and that was a good job for me at school. And I had to get jobs during the summer. I went to work for a little company between my sophomore and junior year, a little company called Starcom. And as I went around that summer and interviewed for a computer job, a lot of people asked me, "Did you apply to Microsoft?" And I said, no, maybe you should do that. Back then they were still quite small, maybe 400 people or something. So the next year I sent a resume to Microsoft, and they flew me up and interviewed me and offered me a summer internship. So the summer of 85. And so I came up, did that internship. They liked me.
What were you doing for the internship?
Oh, I had a great job. I was working in a group that did tutorials for Microsoft's business products. So, and why that was a fun job was because I was in charge of the editor and the runtime part of this setup that right down the hallway there were writers and artists that used those tools to create these tutorials to teach people how to use Microsoft things like Microsoft DOS, Word, or Multiplan. And so my customers were like right there, and they'd be asking me like, "Oh, can you do this or can you do that?" And I'm like, "Sure, I can do that. I'm a video game programmer," and I like, put these changes in for them. One day, one of the artists came into my office, and they were making, by the way, the artists were working in ASCII, right? Just to be clear. So they're putting they're drawing like these scenes out of, characters on the keyboard,
like on
right? Parentheses and right. Exactly. And so Janet Vogelzang comes into my office and she says, "Hey, I'm making a little scene that takes place in a dentist office, and dentist office always has a fish tank. Can you make like, I want to have a fish tank." And I'm like, "So you want it to move?" And she's like, "Yeah, I want it to move." Like, okay, I can do that. I'm a video game programmer. So I put this little animating capability in there. And she can make these little repeating, basically like a simple little video of ASCII fish swimming back and forth. And then I'm like, "Hey, Janet, can you make me some bigger fish? I have a crazy idea." And she's like, "Oh, sure, I'll make you some fish." So she makes me fish out of, whatever parentheses and less than signs and stuff. And I stayed late at work that night, and I made a program I called Fish, that made fish swim on the screen back and forth. And there was like little grass at the bottom that was made out of parentheses, and the fish would spit out little bubbles that were like, O's or zeros, and they would float up to the top. And I just, it was fish, and I gave it to a few people, and it spread around the office, and pretty soon I'd go home at night and I would see my fish program running on all these people's computers.
Like a screensaver type thing.
Like a screensaver. There weren't screensavers back then. And so anyway, there's a whole fish part to my tale that we don't want to take up the whole story. But yeah, I ended up making multiple fish versions, and both in Windows and the Mac, and I ended up working with Berkeley Systems. They approached me to do the fish for their kind of the original big package of screensavers that had the flying toasters that some people remember
right,
from the old days. So I wrote the fish guy part for that. I became the fish guy too much, so after a while, like everyone was bringing me fish stuff, and so like my office had like fish things everywhere. At one point, like when I left like Word and went to go do games, I had to leave all the fish stuff behind. I'm like, "No, I'm done with fish."
Right. Yeah.
But that was like 10 years later. So
That's so funny. But what a great like calling card though for you, doing your sort of internship, trying to make your mark, and then suddenly you write this little program that all the engineers put on their machines. I mean, that's a great way to get noticed, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And it worked out. And so I got a reputation. And so, after I left that summer, one of the managers called me and he said, "We'd like you to come back next year." And I'm like, what would I work on? And he's like, "I'm not sure. We have an old program, or might put you on a new program." And that's literally all they told me. I'm like, "Well, based on that, the new thing sounds good, And, like a couple of months go by, I get this, long distance call at New Mexico. And it's like, "Oh, sorry, we couldn't put you on the new thing. You're going to be on the old thing." And I'm like, "Oh, well, that's disappointing, but thanks for letting me know." So
the old thing was like Word, or what was DOS Word or whatever.
So the new thing was something called Works, which was Microsoft Works, which I don't even know if people know what that is anymore. But it was kind of an all-in-one version of thing that had like a word processor and spreadsheet, but they were all kind of neutered. The old thing was working on Excel, which was actually a really exciting thing to be working on. It's the first version of it, only the first version had come out on the Macintosh. And so the team was taking that and porting it to Windows, which was also brand new. Windows shipped at the end. The first version of Windows shipped at the end of the summer when I was an intern in '85. I joined the Excel team. I was the youngest of 7 programmers whose job it was to make the first Windows version of Excel. And it was just an incredible experience for me. The team was really fantastic. I learned so much. I thought I was this hot shit programmer, which I kind of was, or I wouldn't have got the job to begin with. But these guys were so good, and I learned so much from them. As that group, we released multiple versions. That group started to grow. Went from 7 people to 15 to 35. By then I had a small team that I ran. Then I became what's called the technical lead, which is that kind of head programmer across the whole team. And by then the team was 50. And then my boss went over to try to fix Word. And he got in a fight with the development manager. The development manager left, and I liked working for this boss. And he's like, "Why don't you come over, keep working for me?" So I left there and went over to Word as development manager. So now I was managing a team of 60 programmers making versions of Word. And I did that for another 5 years, and we released a bunch of versions of Word, and that was a lot of fun. But, all that time, when I was on Excel and Word, I was playing games. I was a big gamer,
Right.
And that was such a great time to be a gamer, the late 80s, early 90s, the genres that we take for granted today were just starting to emerge, first-person shooters, real-time strategy games. I remember playing, Peter Molyneux's Populous. I remember playing Sid Meier's Civilization, which I knew was, like a copy of this game I'd played on the mini computers called Empire. Copy is a little strong, but it was, based on, like the first sound cards came out, then the first 3D accelerators were starting to come out. It was just an incredible time of change in the game business. And so even though I'm having fun at work, working and, and learning how to run bigger and bigger teams and manage people, at home, I'm playing all these great games, and I just like.
You must have been itching to get back into game dev, basically.
Well, yeah, it was funny. I mean, I wasn't sure I was ever going to do that. It was like a dream from my childhood at that point. It was like, yeah, I had wanted to, go in the game business, but the game business fell apart when I was in college, And so basically what happened was at the end of 10 years, kind of my management, people I worked for came to me and said, really the next step for you in your career is to run a business. Why don't you look around the company and see, by the way, I have 0 business experience other than like running a paper route or whatever, a small shareware business around fish. But anyway, but this is the way Microsoft worked, so it was like, great. And so I started to look around. I looked around at moving to California and running PowerPoint. I didn't really like that. I looked at several different jobs around. There was some interactive TV stuff people were doing that looked like it might be interesting. But then I just kind of had a chance encounter with somebody in an airport, actually, who was like, "Hey, did you know that our boss is leaving running the games group?" I'm like, "I don't even know much about Microsoft's games group." It's like, he's like, "Well, you should check it out," And so I go over there and meet people, and I was really impressed by what I saw. I was a big Command and Conquer Red Alert player at that point. And, I saw the first version of, very early version of Age of Empires by Ensemble. And I was like, "Oh, you're building your own RTS. That's really cool." And, some early 3D games, a game called Fury Cubed, and anyway, just a bunch of random stuff that they were doing. And I met the people, and they were, most of them came from the game business, people like Stuart Mulder, who had been years at Sierra. And I just started to warm up to the idea, well, maybe this would be the job for me.
Amazing. All right. Well, we'll pick that story up in a second. Let's come to your third game. So we're going to go slightly back in the timeline to just before you joined Microsoft in 1983. Tell us, what's this game, Ed, and why'd you love it?
Well, when people ask me what's the best game of all time, I often tell them this game. I'll tell them Mule, which I don't think, I've been doing that for like 30 years, so I'm not sure it's true anymore. But But are you familiar with Mule at all? Is that a
I
new one
know.
on you?
I've been to like talks at GDC about it, but I haven't played it myself.
There you go. So it's an up to 4-player multiplayer game ran on the Atari 800 and some other platforms, Commodore 64, things like that. Was made by incredible designer Danny Buntingberry, and
Incredible
Danny
name.
did many firsts in game development before she died tragically, and went to some of the first GDCs I went to. I got to hear her speak, but it's a game. It's like an economic simulation that takes place on an alien planet called Errata, which is Atari spelled backwards. And, it plays out maybe a little bit like Risk. You're grabbing territory and trying to build, either mine energy or kind of an iron commodity, or these diamonds called crystite. Or you can also harvest energy, like in the desert with big, dishes, because they're supposed to be solar cells. They look like dishes. Anyway, the point is that you're trying to grow your little empire on this planet, and 3 other people are doing it too. And you spend half your time trying to like develop your stuff, and the other half of the time trying to screw over the other people.
Yeah.
And there's a dynamic commodity market for all the materials. So a mule is this little robotic guy that is basically multifunctional, that can transform into a mining vehicle, or could transform into the solar cells you need, or whatever. Mules are made from the iron. People aren't mining enough iron, then mules don't get manufactured, and the cost of mules goes way up. To run your plots on the land, you need energy to make things grow, or to run the mining equipment, stuff like that. So if you don't have enough energy, you don't produce anything. There's a market for energy, so you can buy and sell energy. And the same with food. Food determines how much time you have when it's your turn to run around and fix up your farm. If you're low on food, you have no time. You can't fix things. So you can really easily get yourself in a corner where you can't make progress. If you're not careful. And you can corner markets, you can buy out like all the energy and then cheap, and then sell it to your buddies for as expensive as possible. So it's like it's a game where you're, and there's elements of randomness. Always there's something bad always happens, or good always happens every turn to somebody. So like bugs will come out and eat all your food from your food plot or something. Anyway, so it plays kind of like a board game, but it's, I don't know, it's hard to explain. It's super, super fun. And it's super fun to just like screw over your friends and just you'll be laughing, the whole time. So
Amazing. I'm pretty sure it was picked on the show by Hank Rogers, the guy that found Tetris.
I know Hank. Yeah. Sure. Good guy. Yeah, it's a good choice. Alexei Pajitnov worked in my group for a while. But anyway.
Oh, really? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
but like after he left the Soviet Union and came to the
Exactly.
States. Right. Okay,
Yeah.
nice. Yeah, I mean, tell us about the group. You get there, you see they're making Age of Empires, you think, all right, let's do it. I want to do this, not PowerPoint. And
Exactly.
how is it?
Seems like an easy choice in retrospect, but at the time it wasn't. In fact, I went to my bosses and I said, hey, I've looked all around and I've settled on this one job I really want to do. I want to go run this games group. And the head of my division pulled me in, a vice president, and he said, why would you leave office, one of the most important parts of this company, to go work on something no one cares about?
Wow.
One of the other vice presidents just told me I was committing career suicide. So that was,
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you, what the sort of attitude was of other executives towards video games within Microsoft, but I guess that answers it.
Exactly.
Did that sort of motivate you further to prove people wrong in some way?
For sure. And I probably have a competitive streak in me that comes from playing games, trying not to lose to my friends at Mule. But it's something else too. Like, when I worked on Office, when I worked on Word in particular, I used to say my job is to say no. Like all day long, like people would come in and it would be like, hey, will you add this thing and go off schedule and delay the product? And I'd be like, no, I'm not going to do that. We're on schedule. We want to be on schedule. We want to ship on time. And after a while it wears on you just to be saying no, and so many like other parts of the company are like, if we could just draft behind Word, we'll like get Word to adopt our thing or Excel to adopt our thing,
All right.
Like, it's just tedious to like try to like protect and like, protect your team and be like pushing out on all these forces that are trying to screw up your project so that the people inside can get their work done, So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, when that person said to me, why would you want to go work on something no one cares about? That sounded really good to me. Like, I could work on something no one cares. Yeah, exactly. And so I went over to the group and, really found it to be in great shape. A guy named Tony Garcia had been running it before me. He's still in the industry. And there were great people there working on all kinds of things, from really interesting games to even an online gaming service plan, which we ultimately did. And it was financially in good shape too, because Flight Simulator, they had just acquired the Flight Simulator team, BAO, from Chicago. And one of the first things I did was move them out and get them settled out here in Seattle. But we had a cash cow that's bringing in money. And, I pretty quickly figured out that no one cared about what I was doing, in the company. So it's like, great, let's invest this money in more great games. Let's find more great game developers.
Right. And you're very successful doing that. As I said, you grow the studio from 50 people to more than 1,200, publish more than 100 games, and many of them do very, very well. What were the sort of biggest successes that you remember and the biggest failures?
Oh, you don't remember any of the failures, hopefully. No, I don't know. Try to remember on the failure side, there was a time where people thought real-time strategy was going to go 3D. And Activision had a 3D real-time strategy game. And we also worked with a German developer on a 3D real-time strategy game that was really cool. You could, be zoomed out and see all the units and drag, select, and fight that way. But if there was like a key battle, you could go all the way into and take control of an individual unit, and you could be like driving a tank or whatever. Activision's game, which I'm sorry, I'm spacing on the name of, flopped, and ours was called Urban Assault. I just remembered that. I think I'm going to make up the numbers here a little, but I remember, we launched it, and then, like a month later or something, I was talking to the marketing guys, and I'm like, so how did it go? And they're like, oh, we sold 45. And I'm like, 45,000? And they're like, no, 45 copies. I'm like, oh,
wow,
that's not good. That's not good. So yeah, that one didn't go so well. But I mean, during the PC days, it was really Age of Empires that was really a core part, and the sequels, the Age of Empires, was a core part of our business. We had the whole Madness series, so like Monster Truck Madness and Midtown Madness, Motocross Madness. Those were fun games. I don't know. We did a PC version of Crimson Skies, which was a much loved later Xbox game, but there was also a cool PC version. That was fun when we brought the FASA guys in. And then you're kind of moving into the console part, and games like, obviously the game Halo, which we're going to talk about eventually.
I'm sure we'll talk about that at some point. Well, all right. Let's come to your fourth game. It seems like a good time. This is 1993, so right before all this starts happening for you.
Oh, we should have talked about it during Word, actually. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, tell us, what's the game?
All right. Well, I thought maybe somebody on your project hadn't picked a pinball machine, so I thought I would do a pinball machine. I don't know if you can see, but I'm in my home arcade, and this is my office.
Nice.
So it's filled with classic arcade machines, but there's also some pinball machines
original
around
Pong.
the corner. Yeah, original Pong. There's a computer space over there, and so I've really loved collecting these machines over the last 15 years or so, and restoring them. I'm growing up in a house of electrical engineers, I have some amount of talent in fixing machines.
All right.
And if I get stuck, I know people I can ask. So, in fact, my oldest son just recently graduated and became an electrical engineer.
Oh, nice.
Cool projects. So,
working on your home arcade for you.
So he's more the guy I go to these days when I have problems. But anyway, So my choice was the best pinball machine of all time by the best pinball game designer of all time. The best pinball designer of all time is a guy named Pat Lawler. That's not very disputed among pinball collectors. And this particular game, Twilight Zone, is sort of it's kind of seen. It's the #1 rated pinball machine on IPDB, which is the International Pinball Database for people who don't know IPDB. But it's always a little controversial because it's like the game where they went too far. Like they put too many things in it.
Too many mechanics.
They made it too complicated.
You've just crossed over into the Twilight Zone.
So it's kind of like a game that has just too many features.
Is it based on the TV show, The Twilight Zone?
It is based on the TV show,
right?
Yeah. So it's got all kinds of crazy things. It's got this clock and lots of things run off this working clock that's made out of this all plastic gears that love to get gummed up and jammed. It's got a small playfield that has magnetic flippers. So the regular flipper buttons, when you're up there, turn on and off these electromagnets, and you have to try to flip the ball with these invisible electromagnetic flippers.
Oh, way. Wow.
It has other electromagnets in the playfield that can manipulate the ball in certain cases. But then it has a gumball machine, and you hit balls into the gumball machine and it spits out other pinballs. And one of those balls that can come out of the gumball machine is a ceramic ball, a white ceramic ball. And why that matters is it's non-magnetic. And so then you're playing with this non-magnetic ball that goes extra fast. But it has I've never come close. I'm not very good at pinball, but I've never come close at beating this thing. It has all these different modes and all these you have to go through all these different sort of mini games and light them all up to get to this final wizard mode, which I've only ever read about. Anyway, it's just if you're saying what's pinball machine you want to take to a, desert island, this is the one, because you could just keep you entertained for life,
Yeah. Although it sounds like it's got a lot of things that can go wrong, and so probably the salt air is not going to be too good for it.
It would also keep you busy fixing it for sure. Hopefully, you got Amazon drone delivery or something on the island. But but I was playing the other day and I was thinking about how different pinball is than video games, and I think one of the reasons is just the randomness. There's so much randomness in pinball. I think sometimes we make a mistake in games and don't put enough randomness in.
Right.
I grew up playing a lot of card games with my friends, and we were big. Probably the game we played the most was Hearts, but we played all kinds of card games and many poker variants and stuff like that. And so much of the fun comes from being dealt a bad hand, but having to try to deal with it anyway.
Right.
Fight your way out of some difficult situation that you're in, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting when you were talking about Mule, the sort of mechanic you pulled out was the one of the, the bugs coming and eating your crops, which is again like a chance thing that happens that, I guess makes everyone laugh, but also then you've got to try and deal with what you've been, that chaos.
I mean, sure. I mean, sure, like chess is an interesting game because it has no randomness, but it has a kind of limited appeal because of that in a way.
Right.
If you want to make a game for everyone, you want everyone to feel like they have a chance to win with just sitting around the table, and randomness is a way to do that. So yeah, it's interesting to think.
All right, we better talk about Xbox.
You're managing the time. I told you we were going to run long.
That's good. It's good. People will love it. So we left you right at the beginning of our conversation. You've pitched Bill Gates. He's chosen your team. Then you've sort of cleverly amalgamated all of the good ideas from the rival team, and you're now building your direct Xbox. And you said that there were the original plan for it, that it's just really going to be a stealth Trojan horse PC. Some of those things didn't really work out. So, at what point do you settle on what everyone knows as the original Xbox?
Right. So, during that year after we got the initial approval, some interesting things happened. One is that we got a bunch of information that our original plan didn't make a lot of sense. The second was that we went out and we talked to Nintendo, who they're just down the street from us, by the way. Just their office just literally drive right past them. In fact, we had arcade machines in my high school because the Nintendo North American distribution office is just down the street from my high school. So
no way. Yeah, Donkey Kong.
All this stuff is like very close to where I grew up. But anyway.
So hang on, just when you say you just go and have a meeting with Nintendo, would you just sort of email them or write to them and go, hey, we're Microsoft, would you, because they're very secretive, are they going to let you do that? And how easy was it to get that meeting?
I don't remember who set up the meeting, but I do remember when I worked at Microsoft, getting a meeting with someone you wanted was generally pretty easy to do. It was just fair. Like, hey, we're Microsoft. Can we get together and talk? Since leaving the company, I've noticed how much I took that for granted back in the day. But anyway, there was literally like a field between the building I was in and their main building, and that we had fought over that field. We both wanted to buy this field, or like I think they owned it and they wouldn't develop it, but they also wouldn't sell it to us. Anyway, so
that's the true console war, was over this one field. Microsoft versus Nintendo.
Exactly. But anyway, we met with them. You were like, what if you did the hardware and we did the software? And they're like, yeah, no. And then Bill had a meeting with Kutaragi, kind of the same thing with Sony, and they said, yeah, no. And so that was pretty much, okay, I guess we have to do this. If we want to do this, Microsoft really didn't like to do hardware stuff, but it was kind of like, okay, we don't really have a choice. The OEMs don't want to do it. We tried Nintendo and Sony. They don't want to do it, even though we made them what we thought were fair offers. I guess we have to do it ourselves. And so, by the end of that year, we had this famous meeting, which is called the Valentine's Day Massacre. And we had another big meeting with Bill and Steve. We told them all the things that we had learned, good and bad, some of which really pissed them off. Like the fact that we were no longer going to run Windows. They yelled at us about the technical plan, and they yelled at us about the financial plan for hours and hours on Valentine's Day until late into the evening when we had all missed our Valentine's dinners and were in trouble.
Oh, so you all got in trouble when you got home as well. Good, more shouting.
And then at the end of this long meeting, they changed their mind and said, I think we should do this. And they got really behind it and said, okay, we're going to give you guys everything you want. And that's the end of the story. So it was as boring as I can tell that story. Go watch it somewhere else. Sorry, I'm trying to save you some time here.
So what? Yeah, and what did you want? Can you put a figure on it?
We needed a $500 million marketing budget. We wanted our own place and buildings off campus so everyone would leave us alone. We wanted, basically to do the whole project and be left alone. So we want all the resources and we want to be left alone, basically. Which being left alone is a big thing at Microsoft. It's like, this is going to be really hard to do. We're talking about, this was February of 2000. We had this meeting and we were going to ship November 2001. And they knew my reputation was I ship on time. So, which we did. We were actually 1 week late. But that's our excuse for that was 9/11 happened right as we were getting ready to ship. Anyway, so yeah, so they gave us everything we asked for, and they were very supportive. We announced that was, February, of course, Valentine's Day, and Bill showed up as we had asked. That was one of our requests, was that he would come to GDC and kick the project off among game developers, because, from our Microsoft point of view, working with developers is the most important thing. Making the machine easy for people to develop for, and
sure,
we saw that as a real opportunity.
Why was it so important for you to have Bill sort of, announce it?
I mean, this is the best he could get. He was the rock star we had. So it's like, let's have Bill up on stage. People will know we're serious.
Yeah. Yeah. And I suppose it shows that he believes in it as much as anything, right?
Yeah. It kind of ties him to it in a way.
Yeah.
Like he wants to change his mind. You know what I mean?
It's your face
There's
on
some
it,
amount
buddy.
of politics to these decisions.
That's amazing. Well, listen, we're going to come to your fifth and your final game now, which, I think is, ties in. It's the reason, it's a good time to talk about this. I had Alex Seropian on the show literally just 2 months ago, and he told us a story from his point of view. So firstly, tell us what the game is, and then tell us the story of what happened from your perspective, please.
Well, of course, the game is, of course, the original Halo. By this point, late 90s, I had...
I like, by the way, that you call it Halo and not Halo Combat Evolved, because Alex said that's something that they were forced to do.
That was definitely the marketing team.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't have time to get into all that right now, but so kind of as we're coming into this period, kind of the end of the 90s, I'd been going to GDC and other events for years, and it felt like I was starting to really get to know people in the game business. I'd met kind of all my heroes and got a chance to, work with Peter Molyneux and certainly meet Sid Meier, worked with Chris Roberts, many other people. I knew the Bungie's games because I had played one of their games called Myth. I was, like I said, a real-time strategy guy, and Myth was this really unique 3D take on a real-time strategy. So I was familiar with the team from that, and I had run into their biz dev guy, a guy named Peter Tamte, at a conference, and spent some time with him. So anyway, we had, Xbox was approved, and I was, looking at the calendar going, geez, I have to have, launch titles in 18 months, and games take 3 years to build. Well,
right.
What am I thinking? Why did I,
Oh no, that's
all of
stressful.
a sudden it like hit, you get what you ask for, and you go, oh crap. And so that's what it felt like. It was like all hands on deck. We were like repurposing things we were doing on PC to go on Xbox, and we were, talking to every partner we could think of, see what games were in development or partially in development, found this racing game, Dreamcast racing game we could reconfigure to be Project Gotham Racing, that kind of thing. We, signed a deal with GT Interactive to get the rights to do Munch's Odyssey and, that whole series. Worked with Lorne Lanning, who was fantastic, really super fun guy. But yeah, one day my phone rings and it's Peter Tamte on the line. And he told me that their company was struggling. And this was a pretty common story at the end of the 90s, that kind of small developer publishers were really starting to have trouble because it was kind of the rise of the big box stores, and the big box stores didn't want to deal with hundreds of little publishers. If you wanted to get into Walmart, you kind of need to be associated with some big, somebody who had distribution, and there weren't that many. There was Take-Two, us, EA, a few others, Activision. So basically he said, Take-Two already owns a third of us. The natural thing would be for us just to sell the rest to them. But, I hear you guys are doing something interesting too. And I thought you might be interested, in bidding on us instead. I had seen some stuff about what this Halo thing that they were doing, but it was more, I was interested in the company. I had respect for them. I had played their games and there was a time I was desperate for, talent wherever I could find it. And here was talent, calling me up saying there's a chance. So definitely, we got on top of that, sent some people out to Chicago to meet with them. I started negotiating with Ryan Brandt, who was the head of Take-Two, and said, hey, why don't we split this company up? I'll give you all the back catalog, all the games they've made up till now. We'll finish the game Oni for you that's down in California with their California team. All I want is this new thing, Halo, and all the development staff. And we made that deal. We moved all the guys from Chicago out, and then we moved the guys when they were done with Oni up from San Francisco, and they all worked on Halo. And they were, an incredible team from the very start. It's just like, you could tell these guys were amazing. Super talented, super motivated, very clear idea of what they wanted to build. They influenced not just, they didn't just put out their game, but they really had a big impact on Xbox in general, working with Jay Allard's system software team and saying, no, it's more important you give us this than that, blah, blah, blah. When it came to, Xbox Live, which came out a year later, they had a huge part in the design of that as well. So they were very core to everything that we did. The only problem was that the game looked like a PC game. And I spent a lot of time with the games press back then, of course. It was a big part of my job. And, they're all like, rightfully, you're getting in the console business. What do you know about the console business?
Right. Mm-hmm.
5 years earlier, they were saying, what do you know about the games business? And, and they were right, well, we're going to learn and we're going to, do the best we can. And we've learned some things, over 5 years, and hopefully some of those will apply here. But, when I first started showing Halo, a lot of what I got was, this doesn't look like a console game. This doesn't look like Mario. It's the colors aren't right. It's not bright and colorful. It's not, blah, blah,
it's
blah.
pretty bright. But yeah, it's not Super Mario. That's true.
It's not. So, and also we only had so much of it we could show. And we're showing it on machines that were quite a bit weaker than the final Xbox was supposed to be. And so so the last time we showed it publicly was E3 2001. So, that's June of the year we're going to ship in November. And the team, or I don't know who made the decision. The decision was, on the show floor, it would be fun to show the split screen multiplayer and have people stand around and play split screen multiplayer. But of course, that's like the most,
intensive.
resource intensive usage, right? To have 4 guys on the screen and split screens. A lot of shooters don't even do it today. And, I mean, that game had split screen head-to-head combat. It had co-op play, which a lot of games don't do today. It's incredible how much they snuck into that game. And even, LAN multiplayer play, which wasn't even, this is a year before we launched Xbox Live. The guys did so much. But and when we're playing it, behind the scenes, it's by far the most played game, the most fun.
In the office,
but we kept, second guessing ourselves. It's like, yeah, I mean, of course we love this. This is like a PC game, and the press kept reminding us it looks like a PC game. And so, when it came to launch, we weren't sure. We had Lorne Lanning's game, which was, basically the sequel of a Sony PlayStation, franchise that was known to be successful. Yeah. And then we had this PC game, which we thought was really fun, but we're probably biased because we're PC gamers at heart, And so we didn't really know for sure, which is often the case with games. You don't really know until you launch. But
yeah, at what point did you know it had worked and that the response was going to be warm?
I think the day after we launched.
Right.
It was like attaching by far the highest of any game. We got retail feedback quite quickly. It's funny. I was like, I didn't get to play through the whole game until that Christmas. And I sat down and, over a bunch of sessions, got to play through it like everyone else. And there was a few, like the silent cartographer, part I knew like the back of my hand because I was demoing that to press, something like E3, I'd be doing it over and over every half hour for days.
Still one of the best levels in any first-person shooter.
It's so much fun. But like I didn't know, like this will tell you how I'm running like 60 teams at a time. I don't know everything about sometimes not even important things. I didn't know about the flood. Like I didn't know, until I played it. I was like everyone else, like what just happened? It's like, oh my god,
cursing the library level like everyone else.
And so it's so fun to be, I didn't know about the ending. The ending was super fun for me. Probably my favorite memory from playing Halo was just like one of those things that it's not planned. It just happens. I was out in the middle of this, one of the icy areas, and I'm low on ammo, and I'm being harassed by this Banshee, and the thing keeps circling over me and then making passes, is strafing me, and I'm taking a few random shots at it, and so this Banshee's circling me and taking shots at me, and I know he's got infinite ammo, and I don't, and this is going to end badly for me. So finally, I'm like, okay, I just have to stand my ground. I just got to stand my ground and try to take out this Banshee with the last of my ammo. So I stand there and he's coming at me and it's just like a scene from a movie. And I'm like, and his bullets are like making 2 streaks along the ice, like past me, this is the way I remember it at least, and then bam, one of my last shots, catches the guy and he pops out, and I'm like, yeah. And then the Banshee, but the Banshee's still coming at me, right? And it's like crashes on the ice and then it's sliding towards me and I'm like, oh shit. And this Banshee slides right up like to my nose and just stops at the last minute before like running me over and killing me. And I'm like, holy crap. It's like one of those game memories that you just will never forget. It's like I lived through this experience,
Yeah, you knew it was a hit. You just had to wait till Christmas.
It just reminded me of why I love games.
Yeah. So good.
Emergent moments, right? Emergent gameplay.
Okay, Ed. Well, we better go through your console. I mean, we've still got 25 years of your career to cover here, but you've taken us to a pretty good climactic moment there. So, all right, we've got Space War, Rogue, Mule, Twilight Zone (brackets pinball game), and then Halo Combat Evolved. Excellent console. That's
checked them all off.
I mean, great, yeah. I ask all my guests to come up with a name for their console that we can use to market to the world. You've been involved in the naming of a console for real.
I should have remembered that.
Have you got anything better than DirectX box?
I can only think of a bad one, but I'm not sure I should do it. All right, I'm going to do this just because I'm telling you a story. Some people may not like this story, but okay. When we were working on Excel and Word, there was an industry magazine called Info something, and it would like every week they'd come out with these stories, and they would somehow like have stories about like stuff we're developing and things like that, and in particular our code names would leak. And by the way, Xbox was the code name, and it stayed as Xbox only because the marketing people could never come up with something better. So when I was running one of the Word projects, I was like, one day I'm like, what if we had a code name that wasn't inherently bad, but was just like uncomfortable for people to put in print? And they're like, well, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, I was thinking maybe something like moist. Now, I never had the chance to use that code name. I was outvoted, but so I don't know.
Did you ever find the leaker, by the way?
Did I find what?
Did you ever find the person leaking all of the stuff?
No, I didn't.
Oh, that's a shame. Well, okay, all right. Well, I guess we'll call it the moist box. That's really what you want.
I'm going to regret this part of the conversation. If anyone really makes it this far, then they can send me mail.
Everyone makes it this far, actually. Okay, right. We better do one and finally question. So yeah, like fast forwarding to today, I don't think it's any secret that Xbox is, in a hard patch at the moment. If you were given the job to come back in and take charge, what might you do to help save the ship?
Well, I'm a big fan of Phil Spencer. I think he's done a fantastic job since he took over. I don't like Game Pass, but that's probably something that we'd have to have a longer conversation about why I don't like it. I've certainly had it with him.
Well, just quickly, let me jump in then. So is that because you feel it's devaluing games in some way, or some other objection? Right.
No, that. I don't want to create the Spotify of games. And because Spotify, I think, has really devalued music and music creators. But maybe AI is going to do the rest. We'll see. I think Sony and Nintendo have clearly showed that what matters is having great first-party content, great original games. And that's what Microsoft needs to focus on. I had great time the other day playing Keeper, Double Fine. After I left, they canceled Psychonauts. They canceled, and later, came back and bought Double Fine. I'm glad they did. There's very few teams in the world that can do something like Keeper, something so unusual and creative. So they need more of that. And is that really what they're going to get out of the Activision acquisition? I don't know. That was a lot of money. I work with lots of little developers all over the world. That's what I love about my job, running One Up Ventures, and see fantastic teams all the time. And I've invested a little over $50 million. So that's like a thousandth of the amount that they paid. Right, we made over 80 investments. And you get something like Expedition 33 from Sandfall. I did get to meet with those guys when they were early on. Unfortunately, we weren't able to invest early on in that project. For me, it was clearly the game of the year when I played it, and it's really fantastic. I recommend it to everyone I can. So I just think they need to get back to basics and focus on, finding great creators and continuing to strengthen their first party content, because that's ultimately what matters. Anytime they get distracted with something other than that, I think it's a problem. But there's so many great people on that team. There's great people I hired. There's great people who were there before I came in, even who are still there. And, tons of great people who came in after. They've got all the ingredients they need there. They just need to really focus on the core thing of finding great teams and making great games, great original, unique games.
Yeah, it always seems to come back to that. If you go back to the crash in the 80s, that's the thing that rescues the industry, right? Is finding great teams and great games.
It's crashed by people like me making bad Frogger clones. You know?
Ed, this has been so good. Thank you so much for opening up. It's been so much fun. And I wish you all the best with all of those investments you're making, and long may it continue.
Thank you, Simon. I had a lot of fun too.
Thank you so much to my guest, Ed Fries, former Microsoft executive. What a treat that was. I absolutely loved talking to Ed, hearing his story. Lots of those details I didn't know. I've spoken to Ed a few times over the years, either over email, or I bumped into him a couple of times at GDC, the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, back when I used to cover that every year. And I've always just been super impressed by him. Just one of those executives who's very personable, talkative, straightforward. Perhaps that's because he left Microsoft, more than 20 years ago, and so has the freedom to talk freely about these kind of things. But even so, I think his personality came through in that conversation. Just someone who's, I don't know, just like alive to the humor of the situation of making video games and running companies. Of course, this is a serious business in lots of ways, but it's nice to be able to look at it wryly, and I think that's certainly something that Ed was able to do in that conversation. So many great anecdotes as well, lots of things I didn't know. That image of him being a 16-year-old making his clone of the game Frogger, which is one of the best arcade games, I think, of that time. And then just, this company tracking him down, finding out who he was, turning up and offering him a contract, and then, him paying his way through university, through those games that he made, living through the crash, the video game crash of 1983, 1984. And then, of course, it all comes back again with the launch of the NES in New York in 1985, and the industry revives, and, Ed is off, getting his job at Microsoft, working on Microsoft Office and some of these products, but the ground is being prepared for the his move to Microsoft Game Studios and everything that happens with Xbox. Really good. The stuff about Nintendo, did we know that? I don't know. I get a bit lost on like what elements are already in the public domain and aren't. But yeah, the idea that Microsoft's offices were just down the road from Nintendo's. That was not something I was aware of, and I thought it was quite funny that they were squabbling over this field and who was going to get to use that for their purposes. But also Microsoft going to Nintendo and saying, "Hey, how do you guys feel about making the hardware? We make the software." That is, how different things could have been if Nintendo had agreed to that. Of course, Nintendo was never going to agree to that. That is the deal that they had with Sony back in the early 90s, in 1990, 1991. Nintendo was partnering, of course, with Sony to build this CD-ROM add-on for the Super Famicom, Super Nintendo. That deal falls apart. And so from then on, Nintendo doesn't really partner with anyone. But Microsoft did, of course, make some operating system stuff for the Sega Dreamcast back in the day, if you remember that. Sometimes when you, I don't know if this was all of the Dreamcasts, whatever region you were in, but certainly the one here in the UK, I think it had a little Windows logo when you booted up your Dreamcast. So there were some of those collaborations. And then much more recently, Nintendo and Microsoft are working much more closely, just as Microsoft is working more closely with Sony as well to bring its games, those titles that have come out of Microsoft Game Studios onto those platforms. This is all part, I suppose, of the historic move away from hardware, from boxes under our TV sets. Is that going to all change? It certainly seems to be the case with Microsoft and Xbox, moving to become more of just a game publisher, putting their titles on PC and then on other people's hardware. We'll see how it all develops anyway. But interesting times, and I think some of the things that Ed was talking about there, even though that was happening 30 years ago, are still super relevant today here in 2026. Yeah, Ed told me he wasn't going to listen to the episode, but he was probably going to listen to this wrap-up because he said that he'd enjoyed the wrap-up that I did I think he'd listened to Mark Cerny's episode. So I hope he feels I'm representing him and our conversation accurately. I don't know if maybe he won't mind me saying this, but he did mention when he listened to my interview with Mark Cerny. Of course, Mark, this is an episode that came out just before the end of last year. Mark is the lead architect of the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 5. And Mark had worked at Sega with Sega back in the 1980s and early 1990s. And he talked a bit about collaborating with Yu Suzuki, who was one of the key members of the team from Sonic the Hedgehog. And Ed mentioned to me, he said, I was surprised to hear that Mark didn't bring up the anecdote about the time Yu Suzuki punched him in the face. Is that true or not? I don't know. The reason I mentioned it to you, I don't know how robust Ed's source is there or if that's something that Mark revealed to Ed. But anyway, the next person who gets to sit down and interview Mark Cerny should maybe ask him about that. I wish I'd had the chance to. But anyway, okay, other bits and pieces, just a couple of very small things. You'll notice that Ed picked one of his 5 games was technically a pinball machine. Of course, it had digital elements to it. If you're watching this rather than listening to it, so if you're a Patreon supporter, then you would have seen I used footage of the Pinball FX version of the Twilight Zone. So Pinball FX, for anyone who doesn't know, is kind of a video game. They're digitized versions of classic vintage pinball machines, very well regarded piece of software, and they bring out lots of these sort of, you buy add-ons for these classic machines, and they have the Twilight Zone, which was one of Ed's picks. They're generally regarded as excellent conversions, as much as a video game interpretation of a real pinball machine can be excellent. These are the ones to go for. So anyway, I showed some footage of that, and if you're interested in trying out the Twilight Zone, but you don't have, you don't live in North America and have your own pinball engineer who can come and service the machine for you, this is by far the easiest way to try out the game that Ed talked about so eloquently at that point of the conversation. Go back, try that out as well. For those of you, there are a few things that I didn't get to talk to Ed about just because, we already ran for 90 minutes and it was time to bring things to a close. But of course, I would have liked to have asked him about the sale of Rare to Microsoft. This is something that he's talked to me about before, back in the day when I wrote the piece about why Microsoft bought Rare, or why Rare decided to allow itself to be acquired by Microsoft. And he certainly had some spicy opinions on that back in the day. But we didn't have time to get to that. So apologies those of you who were interested in that acquisition. And also, of course, all the work that Ed now does in terms of funding independent games. We heard at the end there how the group that he's part of, One Up Ventures, was interested in funding Clair Obscur Expedition 33, one of the best regarded games of 2025 last year. They've been involved in bringing many fantastic indie games to fruition. So Ed, is still fully involved and invested in the video game industry and also nurturing new talent, crucially, which I think, comes out of those early days at Microsoft Game Studios when that was certainly what he was doing, going around looking for promising games, giving some Microsoft investment and seeing where they landed. And as a result of that, of course, we end up with Halo. What a great conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. So glad to have had Ed on here. If you've got any thoughts or feedback or comments you'd like to make, you can email me at myperfectconsole@gmail.com. If you would like to get more involved in the podcast, the best way to do that is to head to patreon.com/myperfectconsole. It's well worth doing that. You can become a free member, but if you pay a tiny bit of money a month, like, I don't know, $4, something like that, firstly, you'll be supporting the creation of the podcast. It takes a lot of work to pull this together, booking guests, do the interviews, editing it all together. Now we're producing video, so it helps fund all of that. But also, you get some bonuses. You get your episodes a day early. You get them ad-free. You also, right now, it's one of the only ways to get video versions of the episodes, which, we're putting quite a lot of work into. It's not just sticking on a camera and watching us talk. You're also getting footage of all the games that are on discussion, and try and bring in some vintage footage and archival photography. So when, for example, Ed was talking about the arcade at the base of the Space Needle in Seattle, where he cut his teeth playing Computer Space, I managed to track down some photos of that, so threw those in. So yeah, it's hopefully well worth your time watching the video versions as well as listening to them. So of course, no judgment here. However you want to enjoy the podcast is totally up to you. But that's just a way that you can get the video versions. That's patreon.com/myperfectconsole. You can also follow along on social media. We're on Blue Sky, we're on X, we're on Instagram, and on TikTok. On Instagram and TikTok, we're putting out reels in advance of the next week's guest, so you get a little nice preview each week. And there's lots of other stuff happening on Blue Sky and X as well. A huge thank you to Big Games Machine for their help in running the social media side of My Perfect Console. They do so out of the goodness of their hearts, also for a little mention at the end, but I'm so grateful to them for the support that they're showing the show as it grows, On that note, if you've not listened to it before, then please do head back into the archive. We've got all sorts of wonderful guests, like a real spread, but also I think some of the real key individuals that have helped shape the video game industry over the last 40 years. So you can go back and, for example, listen to my episode with Nolan Bushnell, the founder of Atari, who we got some of his story here from Ed's perspective. But yeah, he tells the story of the first time he saw Space War when he was visiting a university and had the idea of putting a coin slot onto the PDP-1 so that people could pay for a game of Space War by the turn. That's how we get Computer Space. As a result of the Computer Space experiments, that leads to Pong, the formation of Atari, and of course the formation of the video game industry as we know it in the early 1970s through to today. So yeah, that's just one example of one of the many guests that I've had on the show. Well worth your time going back into the archive. Speaking of which, next week, my guest is the absolutely brilliant Keza MacDonald. Keza will be familiar to many of you. I know I've had quite a few requests to have her on My Perfect Console from you over email, and so glad to have had her on. She has been covering video games in the industry really since she was a child. She got a job on Games TM, if you remember that magazine. That was kind of a rival to Edge magazine, big deal here in the UK, when she was just 16 years old. And then through her experiences there, winds up at IGN. I think she was global, the UK games editor at IGN, and was helping to shape the site's editorial strategy. From there, she moves on to launches Kotaku UK. Was really there in the heyday of the Kotaku website, working with Stephen Totilo, Evan Narcisse, and some other really fantastic writers who have gone on to do incredible things in the industry. Won lots of awards. And now, most recently, of course, you'll know her as games editor of The Guardian newspaper, one of the biggest websites in the world, of course, The Guardian, but also, one of the most widely read games sections in mainstream media. Keza runs that. I, of course, had the previous editor of The Guardian games coverage on, Keith Stewart, about 18 months ago. But we've got Keza on, and part of the reason for having Keza on is that she's got a new book out. It's called Super Nintendo, How One Japanese Company Helped the World Have Fun. It's out this week, or just came out a few days ago. So she's coming on to talk about her book, her career, the experience of how she brought Demon's Souls to the West. And I think, she genuinely had a huge impact in From Software's arrival in the West. Not that it wouldn't have happened anyway, but certainly with that game Demon's Souls, she was the one who helped bring it to the attention of many people, including myself, over here in the West. So we get into all of that. We hear Keza's brilliant story. So please do join me next week. I'll be back again with Keza, with her 5 games, and with one more Perfect Console.